Thank you, Gene. With you doing such a good job singing an Elvis song, I just hate we didn't get to see you dance like Elvis, too. But Gene, seriously, good, very, very good job, though. Thank you. Our children can head out to Children's Church, and y'all can turn with me once again to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. Matthew 5, 13 through 16. This last summer, Hillary and I bought a charcoal grill for the first time in our marriage. We never really had an outdoor grill before. We just used the little George Foreman inner kitchen. So really it was our first foray into grilling. And by no means would I say that I'm a grill master. I'm certainly haven't become a John Mitchell yet. That's will maybe one day come sometime in the future. But over a few months of grilling, I was able to learn a few things about grilling. One of them being is that one of the most important things about getting your food right is the seasoning. Whether that's dry rub, whether that's marinade, you got to get your seasoning right for the meat to be right. Well, so too, God has seasoned His creation. But God's seasoning upon the earth is us. Each and every one of you today who are followers of Jesus Christ, you are a grain of salt that God has taken and seasoned His creation and has mixed you in with the world, mixed you in with the community and in your family. Or to use another analogy that Jesus used is that you are a light that God is shining, or you are a lamp that God has placed within your home, within your community to bring about good. And if you're there with me in Matthew chapter 5, you can follow along once again as I read verses 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Now, last week, again, we looked at this exact same passage, but really, we looked at it from a different angle than we're going to take today. Last week, we looked at the passage from the world's standpoint and what this passage teaches us about the world. And the fact that the world needs salt and light tells us something. The fact that the world needs salt means the world in and of itself is a rotten and festering place. Left to itself means it will rot and spoil. Also, the fact that the world needs salt means that the world is a flavorless place, that it is bland, needing flavor. The fact that the world needs light means that it is an ignorant world living in darkness. Paul said in Ephesians 4 that the world is darkened in their understanding of life. The world lives in darkness and foolishness, and in light of that, our lesson last week was that we must not become like the world. Yes, we are people in the world, but we are not of the world. And so today we're shifting that focus. In light of the fact that the world is a rotten and festering, flavorless, dark and ignorant place, how then are we to live? How are we to be the salt and light in the world? And so today, here's 4 ways this passage teaches us that we can be salt and light. The first one seems to be pretty self-explanatory, but I'll dig into it a little bit. First point is this, is that we should be salty, right? We should be salty, not like Kentucky fans were last night about the refs. That's a different kind of salty, okay? But we should be salty. It's amazing. Whoever loses has a different view of the refs than everybody else. If y'all didn't want us shooting 44 free throws, then don't foul us. It's that simple, all right? Hey, we have to go to Lexington at the end of the year. I understand that. So, point being, don't be salty. Another way of putting it is be different. We are to be different. A little salt is sprinkled within a large portion of meat. That salt is a different substance from the meat of which it was sprinkled. That's why it was effective. Look, if you were wanting to preserve a steak, okay, you wouldn't get other pieces of steak and sprinkle and crumble up on top of that other steak. Crumbling and sprinkling steak up on top of steak doesn't do anything, right? Even if you got another piece of meat, if you sprinkle chicken on top of steak, it's not going to preserve anything. The salt in and of itself has to be different. The fact that the salt preserves the meat necessitates that it is different from the meat. It's in the meat, yes, it's in the meat, but it's different from the meat. Look with me at a few passages. John chapter 1. If you don't want to turn there, that's fine, just listen. But if you'd like to turn there, John chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. John chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. John tells us, in him, speaking of Jesus, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Okay, so the light of Jesus is within us, and then through us, Jesus shines his light into the world. And there is a clear distinction. What is coming from Christians is light. What is in the world is darkness. Philippians chapter 2, verse 15. Philippians chapter 2, verse 15. But yeah, I'll begin in verse 14 for context. This is the beginning of the sentence. This is another one of those verses that we have taught to our children and made them memorize and that we go back and refer to regularly, at least verse 14. Verses 14 and 15 of Philippians chapter 2. Do all things without grumbling or questioning. Other translations say, do all things without complaining or arguing. Verse 15, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. Listen to this, among whom you shine as lights in the world. The New International Version says, among whom you shine like stars in the sky. All right? Again, there's this idea that you are in the world. We live in a twisted and crooked generation. But though we are in it, we are clearly distinct from the world. Just as you look up into the night sky and you can clearly delineate the stars from the darkness. Ephesians chapter 5 now. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 7 through 10. He had just been talking about the sexually immoral and impure and the covetous and the idolaters. Ephesians 5, 7 through 10. Therefore, do not become partakers with them. Okay, you live among the sinful, but don't sin like them. Therefore, do not become partakers with them. Why? For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true, and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. We are in the world, but we are distinct and we are separate from the Lord. A lot of times Elijah will ask me questions about celebrities. It could be actors. Typically it's about athletes. But he'll ask me if I know if such and such athlete is a Christian or if they're not. Most of the time when he asks me, I don't know for certain. But oftentimes, by their life, by the way they live, I kind of have a good guess at whether they are or not. And most of the time, based off the way they carry themselves in their sport, off the way they carry themselves outside of the sport, their demeanor, the way they speak, the way they live within their families, it's telling you something. And most of the time, it gets me curious, and I'll begin to Google, I'll begin to look up, and generally, if there's somebody that I think is a Christian, Most of the time they are. All right, Drew Brees is one who is an example of that. A man that for a long time I did not know, but based off the way he lives, it gives pretty good evidence that he is, and sure enough, he is. Ryan Tannehill, the quarterback for the Titans. A lot of people started following the Titans this year with their playoff run. Same thing. The way we live is distinct and different from everybody else. And oftentimes it is evident and easy to see that. Jesus asked a question today. If salt loses its saltiness, how can that saltiness be restored? Now that's a rhetorical question because it can't. It can't be restored. It is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out, and he says trampled under people's feet. So thinking about this practically, how can salt lose its saltiness or its flavor? It's this: by mixing with impurities, by compromising what it really is, by ceasing to be salt. It mixes with impurities. It compromises, and that's no different from us. We lose our saltiness, we lose our godliness when we stop being distinct from the world, when we start fitting in and mixing into where people can no longer tell, are they a Christian or are they not? I don't know. All right? We lose our saltiness when we compromise, when we become like the world, when we lose that which makes the difference. Now, as we discussed last week, there's a balance to be found here because we do have to be in the world but not of the world. We have to be friends with lost people but not be yoked to lost people. And folks, sometimes in life, this is how we a lot of times end up compromising who we are. Sometimes in life, oftentimes I might say, the world can be alluring. We want to taste it. We want to touch it. We want to experience all the things that the world is doing. It looks like they're having fun. It looks like they're gaining joy from it. It looks like something that I would want. It looks so fun and enjoyable. And to be honest, it doesn't even seem to be harming of those who are partaking in it. So even though we know that what they're doing is wrong or probably wrong, we try to partake in just a little bit of it, right? Just a little bit of it won't hurt. I won't go all the way, just a little bit. Or maybe I'll try to get as close to it as possible. You know, it's kind of like your children or grandchildren when they're not being peacemakers and they're annoying each other, and one of them says, "Don't touch me, stop touching me." And so what does the other one do? They get their finger and they get it as close to their face as humanly possible. And the other one blows up and gets so angry, says, "I told you not to touch me." And you say, "I'm not touching you. I'm just as close to you as humanly possible without doing it." How often are we like that with the world? I'm not touching it. I'm not technically doing it. We want to do it. There's something in us that draws us to it. When I was in youth in Alabama, when I was in high school, we were having a revival weekend. And the church I grew up in, of course, had over 2,000 people in it. So revival weekends, we'd have a revival preacher, a revival music minister. We'd have a revival youth minister come and preach to the youth. And he was preaching to the youth one night. I was either a junior or senior in high school. And we had a stage up there that they preached on. And he asked in there, he wanted everybody to nominate or to pick and choose who they thought was the biggest and strongest youth in there. So naturally, everybody looked at me and picked me. And so they then called me up on the stage. He called me up on the stage. He wanted to make a point, okay? And he had me get right on the edge of the stage. And he said, "I'm going to pull you off the stage." And he said, I'm going to try to pull you off the stage. But I want you to keep your balance and stay on the stage. All right? Even with me being the biggest and the strongest one in there, he pulls and I immediately fall off the stage. He then tells me to go all the way back to the wall. And he says, "I want you to hold your ground, and I'm going to try to pull you off the stage from back there." He couldn't budge me. He didn't even pull me one step. And the point was clear. The closer you get to the edge, the more likely you are to fall. The further away you are from the edge, the more likely you are to be able to stand firm in your faith. Yet we as Christians, when we look at the world, we're always wanting to taste it, to touch it, to get as close, to find that enjoyable nature in it. The world is alluring, but we must remember that it is rotten and festering and stinks. I was coaching a basketball game a couple of years ago in ABA when the coach we were coaching against began to act up and really show his rear end. The other players began to do the same thing. It really turned into a dirty game. And at halftime, when I was talking to the team, I was reminding them not just about plays that we're going to run, but I talked to them just about how we were going to play. Yes, we were winning at the time, but my message to them was, don't sink to their levels. All right, we're going to win with class. We're going to lose with class. We're going to stay above their mess. And I remember using those words. We're going to stay above their mess. And I think Jesus' message is the same to us here. It is a rotten world that we live in. Don't fall into the rottenness. Live in holiness. Teenagers, the temptations of sex, of drunkenness, of popularity. It's rotten. Stay away from it. Parents, the allure of money and possessions. Money and possessions aren't wrong, but the craving for it, the allure of it, it's rotten. Stay away from it. All right, money is not the root of all evils. It's the love of money, Paul says. Men, the allure of pleasure and ease and comfort. Women, the allure of reputation. It's rotten. Stay away. Rise above it and seek something better. All right? Be like salt. Be different. Separate yourself from how everybody else is living. In our differences, not only will we be different, but those differences will not always be accepted. Women, in today's age, for you wives who accept the biblical teaching that you submit to Christ by submitting and following your husbands, you will be a fool to most other women. In fact, you'll be unworthy of being a true woman. In fact, you'll be told that your position is hurting women and demeaning women around the world. No one will understand why you believe what you believe and why you do what you do and live the way that you live. You will be a fool to the world. Men, for you who believe that you are to lead your families, not like a dictator, but lovingly as Jesus loved the church, who gave himself up for his church. All right? Jesus, who is our leader and the example that we men follow, Jesus says he did not come to be served, but to be a servant of all. And we lead our families that way. But even if we are the greatest servants in our families, the fact that we believe that we are leaders, you will be a bigot and a dictator to the world. Women who give up careers to stay home and raise their children will be viewed as wastes of talents. Children who choose to obey their parents will be weak. They'll be sissies for not following and doing what the friends and everyone else is doing. Guys, the world doesn't understand. But let me ask you this. If you lose your saltiness by mixing and compromising with the world, how will they taste godliness? If you lose your saltiness by compromising and becoming like the world, how will the world taste godliness? Could it be that those who disagree with you, all they've ever feasted upon is rotten meat, and Christ has sprinkled you into their lives as a preservative so that their world doesn't fester? But if you lose your saltiness, what good are you doing? And so God's command is don't compromise. Be different and rejoice in those differences. Secondly, Not only should we be salty and different, but we should be flavorful. We should be flavorful. And what I mean by this, another way of saying it, is that we should display Christ. We should be flavorful, and the flavor that we are presenting is that of Christ. Folks, for the world to taste of Christ, we have to put our godliness on display for others to see. Now, this is kind of backwards for a lot of people, because really this, on surface level, seems different from everything that Matthew chapter 6 teaches. If you're there in Matthew chapter 5, you can look over one chapter to chapter 6 and look with me in verse 1. He says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. So hold on. Point number 2 right here is I'm saying you've got to live in a way to where that people see Christ. Put your actions on display for others to see. Here, Jesus says, don't do that. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Now let's get an understanding of that. Let's keep reading. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. Listen to this, that they may be praised by others. The giving, the praying, the fasting, the examples that he uses of how hypocrites do all 3 of those things publicly to be seen by others, he's not saying that you literally can do nothing publicly. All right? He doesn't mean you literally can't pray or give or fast publicly. He doesn't mean that. What he's saying is we cannot do those things for us to receive the praise and the attention. When we give to the needy, when we pray, when we fast, we do those things not to put our own righteousness on display, but rather the righteousness of Christ. The flavor that we give to the world is Christ. Another example of this, you don't have to turn here, is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 15. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. But verse 12, he actually takes that even further than just silencing their ignorance and their sin. Verse 12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, listen to this, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Our lives, our goodness that we're displaying before the world is not for people to look back at us, but rather for people to see them and say, wow, isn't Christ wonderful? Going back to the light analogy, Christ is the light of life. And he rescued us, Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 8. He rescued us from the dominion of darkness and transferred us into the dominion of light. That we would project that light, that we would declare the excellencies of him. And guys, it's the same with salt. Christ gave us our saltiness so that when we flavor the world, we are spreading Christ. We are displaying Christ. There's an intentionality to our lives. Back in November and December, during our Who's Your One focus, which I hope everyone is still praying for their one, is still seeking to be intentional about engaging your one and inviting them. But we began this by doing 30 days of prayer. All right, we still have other books over here if you want to get that and continue through it, or you didn't participate in it to begin with. We posted those online. Day 15 of the 30 days was a prayer that really jumped out to me and convicted me. Listen to this prayer. God, the psalmist calls me to sing to the Lord and declare his salvation among all people. Cause my life to overflow with your joy. Make me sing your praises day to day. Bring to mind consistent evidence of your grace in my life. As you do, listen to this, as you do, make these realities spill over into the words that I speak to my one. Allow me to testify to the wondrous works you've performed in my life. When I experience your blessings, compel me to testify to the fact that God alone is the source of my joy and the only basis for my hope. The thing that jumped out to me is that really in my mind, in engaging my one, it was always some intentional thing about how I'm going to bring up Christ for the point of witnessing to them. I'm going to bring up Christ for the point of inviting them to church. But really what this prayer is just let my language be salted with Christ. Let my love for Jesus just overflow in my life, whether I'm being intentional or not. Let Christ ever be on my tongue. And I mentioned this last week, but again, what Nash said on the cruise, it's the perfect example. When the guy on the shuttle was carrying them away from the cruise, he told Nash, he said, "You've probably never seen anything as big as that before." And Nash just that quickly said, "I know something bigger." And the guy said, "What?" And he said, "God." Just that quickly, he took a normal conversation and turned it spiritual. And even going beyond that, as they were out on that cruise, Wade had said he was teaching their children about the passage from Isaiah to where it says that God holds the waters of the earth in the hollow of his hand. All right? So Nash's parents had been teaching them truths about God. Nash had been taking that in, and then it just naturally overflowed in conversation. It wasn't something intentional. He didn't say, "Okay, I got to do it. I got to take this step, and I got to talk to somebody about Christ." It just overflowed out of his heart. Right? Why is it so easy for a 5-year-old and not for us? But that's the prayer that they're saying here in day 15 of day 30. Let it ever be on my tongue. Paige Patterson, the former president of Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, he says this threefold prayer every morning. God, give me opportunities to talk to people about Christ. Give me eyes to see those opportunities, and then give me boldness to take those opportunities. So give me opportunities, let me see them. Give me boldness to take them. Listen to this. Salt is only useful when it gives of itself. We salt the world through Christ. We change the world through Christ. And in this political year, I'm going to get political again. We do not change the world through anger. We change the world through Christ. We will penetrate the darkness of the world through the gospel, not through politics. Okay? Now, hear me out. I'm not saying that Christians should not be involved in politics. One of the reasons I think politics are in the dumpster is because not enough Christians are involved in politics. We as Christians need to fulfill our obligation to go and vote and influence the world that way. But just think about this. All the good that Matt Bevin did for the unborn children of this state, what happened? Because people didn't like some of his other policies and his demeanor, our new governor is now completely undoing all the good that he did and is opening the state back up to murdering children. And no, that's not a diatribe that I'm getting on and just speaking off the cuff. It's in my notes. I wrote it right here. I mean it. I understand that not everybody agrees with his policies. I understand that his demeanor brought on a lot of people's view of himself. He brought a lot of it on himself. I understand that. But for 4 years, this man was as big of an advocate for the lives of unborn children as any politician this nation has ever seen. And in one day, in one vote, every bit of that was undone. Every bit of it. So let me ask you this. What good did politics do? Nothing. Do I wish he was still governor to continue to protect the lives of unborn children? Yes, I do. But politics didn't change anything. And it's not going to change anything because we live in a broken, festering, rotten world. Has demonstrating and picketing and boycotting and arguing and Facebook memeing people we disagree with worked and actually made a change? Has picketing and boycotting done anything? Has posting those Facebook memes done anything? Folks, because change does not come through us getting angry. Change comes through Christ. And when we engage in politics, we want the people we disagree with to still have accepting hearts when we come to them with the gospel. But unfortunately, the way Christians today engage in politics, we're just angry. It's not seasoned with grace and mercy. It's seasoned with anger and preference and opinion. And I'm right and you're wrong. Our job as the church is not to corporately involve ourselves in politics. I believe that. You may disagree with me, but it's my views. Our job is not to corporately involve ourselves in politics. Forcing law changes doesn't change anything until the next group gets control again and undoes everything else. And that goes both ways. We rather want to influence change, not from a corporate level. We want to influence change from an individual level, not through politics, but through the gospel. And here's the thing, guys. When Christ has gripped someone's heart and has turned them into a new creation, you know what happens? The politics change with them. What's happening with the world, with the nation today, could be because we don't have enough Christian politicians. Or it could be that over the last few generations, we Christians have just gotten really good at yelling from the mountaintops, trying to force corporate change, and we're not taking the gospel to the individuals. We're not being the salt, the light. The hope for this nation is not Donald Trump. It's not the Republican Party. It's Christ and only Christ. Point number 3 is that we should project light. We should project light. We have a tendency to cover our light, but rather we should project it. Jesus in this passage uses an analogy that is utterly ridiculous, but he does so intentionally to prove a point. It might not hit home with us as much today as it did in previous generations when he says, no one lights a lamp and sets it under a basket. We don't use lamps today, oil lamps. We just flick on a switch, right? But to get a lamp to run, you have to trim the wick, you have to fill it with oil, you have to light it. It took work to light that. It would make no sense to go through that hassle and then cover it up. Maybe a similar analogy today may be somebody intentionally putting in a bulb that's already burned out. All right, I need light in the room. I'm going to put in a light bulb that I know doesn't work. All right, that makes no sense. Bulbs are supposed to give light. Yet how often do we, with light inside of us, how often do we cover our light? And so very quickly this morning, what might be some of those covers or those bowls that we are putting over our lamps? What are some things that we are using to shield the light from reaching the world? First question, does the fear of man keep you from shining brightly for Jesus? Does fear of man keep you from shining brightly for Jesus? We are scared to evangelize and tell someone about Jesus. We're scared, quite simply. We want to, we're just scared. We are scared to make a stand in school and tell somebody else that they're doing wrong. Or maybe even all of our friends, maybe we're having a sleepover, maybe it's in the school cafeteria, maybe on the playground, whatever it is. Maybe the other group of friends, there's 5 of you, the other 4 are beginning to do something wrong, and you know that it's wrong, and you know you want to take a stand, but fear of those other friends keeps you from salting that group with Christ. We, as God's people, must be more for His own glory than our own glory. The fear of man is essentially this: I want you to think better of me. Being salt and light to the world says, I want you to taste Christ. Does pride keep you from shining brightly for Jesus? This fits somewhat into the fear of man, but essentially, what will somebody think of me? I can't evangelize. What if I do something wrong and I mess up? Guys, that's pride. I want to be perfect, and I'm not going to do something unless I know I'm perfect at it. Does sin keep you from shining brightly for Jesus? To be honest, you're not living in godliness because your sin is just too much fun. You're having too much fun in the life. You don't want to give it up. You know it's wrong, but it brings you too much pleasure. Does comfort keep you from shining brightly for Jesus? It's hard work living in godliness. It can be awkward talking to people about Jesus, and it's just easier to just conceal my light. Peer pressure, parental expectations. This probably goes more towards young married people. You know what is right to do, but your parents have certain expectations on you, telling you things to do, manipulating you through guilt and sorrow to get you to do what you know you shouldn't. Maybe your own ambitions and agenda. This is what I've always wanted for my life, but the Bible now won't let me do it. And so I'm putting my own desires above the desires of Christ. A true Christian, listen to this, not only does not cover his light, but he does not even desire to do so because he sees the foolishness in it. Okay? And so I realize all of those things, I'm going to be covering a light, but this analogy that Jesus used of lighting a lamp and immediately putting a basket over it, that's foolishness. When I let any of those things stop me from living for Christ, I am being just as foolish. Fourth, and finally, to shine like a light in the world, we should keep our lamps ready. We should keep our lamps ready. For that lamp to work, we must have oil and we must trim our wicks. The oil that we need for life is Christ. Christ is the light of life. Therefore, we draw our strength from Him. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. Paul writes this to the church at Corinth. For one thing, the passage before that in verses 3 and 7 speaks about God comforting us in all of our affliction, God comforting us in our suffering. Verse 8, he says, "For we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia." Listen to this. "For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself." How many times have you heard people say, God will never put on you more than you can handle? That's not true. Paul himself said that he and the other apostles with him were burdened beyond their own strength to the point that they despaired of life itself. Verse 9, "Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death." Why did God allow this to happen? The second half of verse 9. "But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead." We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us not live in our own strength, but rather to look to Christ and draw our strength from Him. In life, we do the same thing. We cannot be the salt and the light of the world in and of our own strength. So day after day after day after day, I come to God's Word. I come to God in prayer, drawing my oil from Him, drawing my strength. But not only that, is that I must trim my wick. All right? Some of you who may remember oil lamps, I remember, even though, of course, I've grown up in electricity, but back at my parents' house when the electricity went out, we had a little oil lamp. And I remember my parents lighting that, the oil being in the bottom and the wick kind of drawing it up. But you got to trim that wick to get the burnt part off so that there's still a good, healthy wick there. We trim our wicks through discipline. through reading my Bible day after day after day, attending church even on Sundays that I don't feel like it, surrounding myself with godly people who will encourage me and even rebuke me, specifically focusing on our lives and our marriages, looking for things that need to be fixed and righted and taking steps to do so. Guys, don't wait until your marriage is crumbling to say there are things that need to be fixed. Fix them as it happens. It's the same thing with vehicles or anything else. All right, the old proverb, a stitch in time saves 9, right? Meaning when there's just a tiny hole, one stitch can fix it. If you don't fix that one, it's going to get bigger and you're going to have more stitches. The same things with your life. Be disciplined. Deal with issues as they arise. We also trim our wicks by living in accord with the Beatitudes from the previous passage. We trim our wicks by keeping ourselves unstained by the world, keeping ourselves separate from the world. And I end with this. The title of this sermon series is Standing Firm in a Fallen World. Standing firm in a fallen world. So what's the lesson for today? If you want to stand firm in this fallen world, then be different from the fallen world. Draw your strength from Christ. Then display that Christ. Don't give in to the world. Don't give up when life gets hard. Stand firm, and when you do fall, turn to Christ in repentance and trust. Let Him pick you up, brush you off, set you on your feet, and then stand firm. Be diligent day after day after day. Fill your life with oil. Trim your wicks. Influence the world. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.